On April 30th, when Richard Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, further escalating the war, it brought with it widespread protests all over the country, and Kent State was no exception to that. There was an action in downtown Kent that Friday night, which resulted in the breaking of windows in a number of buildings, the spray painting of buildings with anti-war slogans, and a pretty spirited gathering of students.
One of the lessons that I pulled away from my education about May 4th is this idea of learning to think for yourself and standing by what you believe. You need to encourage others to do the same, even if they disagree with what you believe. And you take those differences in beliefs and you challenge your own opinions and you try to become a better self through that.
On Saturday, May 2nd, there was a lot of unrest on campus, like where do we go from here? Students were talking a lot about the militant actions that took place in downtown Kent. And so it was not surprising. The focus of the student protests at Kent State was at the ROTC building.
Even in the face of violence, even in the face of a National Guard who did have guns, and regardless if students knew that they had bullets in their guns or not, they were still standing in the face of violence, and they were still willing to speak about things that were passionate to them, even at the very local level at Kent State University, about a very federal issue. I think students my age should look at the issues that are facing us today and act. Why are we not more upset about, for instance, the price of college tuition? Why do I have to choose between getting an education and surviving? That shouldn't be a decision I have to make, but those are things that I have to consider.
On Sunday, May 3rd, it was not surprising to see a large gathering near the home of the university president, and that's where we gathered on Sunday to talk to him about the oppressive presence of an armed military camp on our campus. We were armed with something far bigger than their guns. We were armed with the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. We have a right to be here, so go away. And instead, the tear gas started to fly. Within minutes, we could hear helicopters overhead with searchlights. The gunmen were running toward us with fixed bayonets. That is such a shocking turn from a peaceful sit-in. We looked very, very forward to the noon rally planned the next morning, when we would not only be able to protest what had happened to us the night before, but we would be joining with students all over the country to protest the escalation of the Vietnam War into Cambodia.
The guards couldn't really understand the students, and the students couldn't understand the presence of the guards there. And that created that conflict that resulted into that tragedy. May 4th, they happen in other countries too.
On Monday, May 4th, we had just come off of an entire weekend of protests on our campus, in our city, in the state of Ohio, and in cities across the country, with a very, very strong message to Richard Nixon that we would not tolerate an escalation of a war that he had promised to wind down, and now we would do whatever we could to end that war. That's what I remember most that morning, was how powerful it felt to have a voice so broad, to be part of something so big. But when they reached the pagoda at the top of the hill, they surprised us. Just Troop G, while the other guardsmen continued over the hill, they turned in unison, lifted their weapons, and started firing. For 13 horrifying seconds, we wondered about all those students out there in the open who didn't find a car or a tree to get behind. That's what I remember thinking the entire time I crouched and waited for 13 horrifying seconds. When the gunfire stopped, I think every one of us who was there will recall the deafening silence. this silence of shock and disbelief. And the horror just crescendoed into this unified cry of, "What have you done? What have you done?" And then we saw all around us what they had done.
Located right beside Taylor Hall is a parking lot, the parking lot that 4 students unfortunately passed away during the May 4th shooting. And I have parked in that parking lot. I have walked across it. I have talked to my friends while walking across it. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about something that people encounter daily, having such a wound located there. I really am grateful that I have been able to attend Kent State and been around what happened with May 4th and been able to exist in that space, because it fires me up, honestly, every time I see it, to just keep fighting, because some of the things that they were fighting for back then we're still fighting for now. And we can't become complacent. Complacency that is a privilege and one that we cannot afford.
Until I visited the Vietnam Memorial for the first time, I knew it was this big black slab of granite that you could see your reflection in, and that had the names of all of the soldiers that died in Vietnam on it. And I walked the entire length of that slab looking for my brother's friend Bill, who died and was buried just less than 2 weeks before May 4th, 1970. I wanted to get an etching of his name, and when I finally found his name right there near May 4th, 1970, then I continued to the right to finish looking, and I noticed for the first time how much smaller and smaller and smaller that granite memorial got. And I saw the visual representation of the impact of the student anti-war movement, because the war began to wind down. And I'll never forget how I felt when I walked to the very end of it and saw that last name